Hello Zer0 Books readers, it's me again, Douglas Lane. In this video, we'll be taking a look at an upcoming book from Matt Rosen entitled Speculative Annihilationism. We'll consider the demarcation problem, and we'll find out why the arrival of the intellectual dark web is such a bad sign. But before we do any of that, let me tell you what it is that the dark intellectual Jordan Peterson gets right.
Well, look, you always have to give the devil his due. And there's a central postmodern claim which arises from a very complex conundrum. And the conundrum is one that emerged in domains outside of the humanities, let's say. Although it emerged in the domain of literary criticism, because what happened in the mid-60s was that a very large number of disciplines simultaneously realized that it was actually technically impossible to perceive the world because there was an infinite number of ways that you could perceive the world.
What Peterson gets right is that there was a broad realization that it might be technically impossible to perceive the world as it really is. Back in the 60s and 70s, academics, scientists, and other intellectuals remembered that the problems that previous philosophers had raised, such as the problem of perception or the problem of induction, hadn't been overcome, or to be more accurate, these philosophers became dissatisfied with the solutions that had been offered in the past. In the scientific realm, for instance, what became untenable was Karl Popper's solution for the problem of induction. Back in the 18th century, philosopher David Hume had argued that our belief in causation, the idea that there's a necessary connection between a given cause and its effect, has no rational justification. While we might think that we know that hitting a cue ball with a pool stick causes a cue ball to move on the table, this belief in causation is really only an assumption or a habit. We have a tendency to believe that the world will continue on as it has in the past. That the sun will rise in the morning, that when we press the button for our food pellet, we'll get our food. When we turn the knob for our shower water, we'll get scalded, and that when we hit the cue ball with our pool stick, the ball will move. What Hume pointed out is that we can't justify that assumption, or any of those assumptions. Just because we've seen something happen in a particular way in the past, that doesn't mean that the same thing will continue to happen in the same way in the future.
Perception is not really, in my opinion, the main source of our knowledge. The role of perception is to inform us about a momentary situation in our environment.
In the early 20th century, another philosopher named Karl Popper came along and argued that Hume had misunderstood what we are really doing when we come up with scientific theories about billiard balls and pool sticks, celestial bodies and their orbits, or shower stalls and water. According to Popper, a scientist who is attempting to verify a theory about any of these things isn't trying to justify the theory or to establish certain or true knowledge, but rather that scientific understanding works negatively. Rather than finding the correct explanation, the trick is to speculate about possible answers to problems like why the cue ball moves when you hit it, and then to go about finding problems with your speculations. The speculations that have the least obvious problems, that have been tested and not yet found to be false, are the ones that scientists continue to use and test. According to Popper, a theory which is not refutable by any conceivable event is non-scientific. Irrefutability is not a virtue of a theory, as people often think, but a vice. Every genuine test of a theory is an attempt to falsify it or refute it. Many in the scientific community embraced Popper. Sir Peter Medawar, a biologist who won the Nobel Prize for Medicine, once said that Popper was the greatest philosopher of science in history. However, there were also many who rejected his argument. And one of those philosophers who rejected falsification as the basis for scientific knowledge was Popper's own student, Imre Lakatos. Lakatos moved beyond Popper's idea that a theory was scientific if it could be falsified to his own idea that a theory was scientific if it progressed.
Is then Popper's falsifiability criterion the solution to the problem of demarcating science from pseudoscience? No. For Popper's criterion ignores the remarkable tenacity of scientific theories. Scientists have thick skins. They do not abandon a theory because facts contradict it. They normally either invent some rescue hypotheses to explain what they then call a mere anomaly, and if they cannot explain the anomaly, they ignore it. What is then the hallmark of science? Do we have to capitulate and agree that the scientific revolution is just an irrational change in commitment? That it is a religious conversion? Tom Kuhn, a distinguished American philosopher of science, arrived at this conclusion after discovering the naivete of Popper's falsificationism. But if Kuhn is right, then there is no explicit demarcation between science and pseudoscience. There is no distinction between scientific progress and intellectual decay. There is no objective standard of honesty. But what criteria can he then offer to demarcate scientific progress from intellectual degeneration?
Lakatos' theory was interesting and worth examining in full, but for now I'll just point out that Lakatos, along with being a student of Popper's, was also a student of the Hungarian Marxist Zer0 Books. Lakatos' notion that scientific truths must progress and develop was, in a loose sense, a Marxist conception. However, it didn't take hold of the public imagination in quite the same way that Popper's notion had, and it was quick to be criticized by other philosophers of science with very different political agendas. For instance, the anarchist philosopher Paul Feyerabend was a friend to Lakatos, even though Feyerabend rejected the notion that science had a rational foundation at all. Here's a quote pulled from Feyerabend's Against Method that I found on Wikipedia. "Is it not possible, asked Kierkegaard, that my activity as an objective or critico-rational observer of nature will weaken my strength as a human being? I suspect the answer to many of these questions is affirmative, and I believe that a reform of the sciences that makes them more anarchic and more subjective, in Kierkegaard's sense, is urgently needed." Feyerabend, while critiquing Popper and Lakatos' attempt to shore up problems that emerged very early in the development of the project of empirical scientific reason, quoted the religious thinker Kierkegaard. And Matt Rosen, in his book for Zer0 Books entitled Speculative Annihilations, leans on Feyerabend as Rosen writes in opposition to, quote, theoretic approaches that conjure the Kantian and post-Kantian conceit that being and thought are inseparably correlated such that neither can be understood independently, and that the human is in some sort of privileged position. What Feyerabend and Rosen want to project is that what is good and true in life can be arrived at in a strictly rational manner. What they are opposed to is the idea that rationality alone should guide us. And any true fan of Jordan Peterson knows that he too objects to human rationality as a foundation for a just society, because he associates rational projects for change with bureaucratic nightmares and atrocities.
And that's what a totalitarian does. The totalitarian says, here's the damn theory, and it's exactly right, and you're going to act it out exactly. And if you don't, well, we've got some special treats in mind for you.
Let me start again in order to make the point of this video clearer. Peterson is correct when he suggests that in the 60s and after, there has been a realization that our foundational beliefs are unsupported, and that we don't have any certain justification for our scientific methodologies or social practices. What Peterson gets wrong is his insistence that his own social crusade is not essentially working with many of the same presuppositions as a radical anarchist like Feyerabend. Another mistake that Peterson makes is when he claims that Marx is the source of the values that people like Feyerabend and Derrida eventually turn to in order to give themselves direction. That isn't the case. In fact, the egalitarianism, striving after emancipation, championing of diversity originate and developed out of the Enlightenment. Given Peterson's claim to be a dedicated free speech absolutist, his rejection of these, quote, Marxist ideas is, again, profoundly inconsistent and strange.
And the postmodern answer to that was, well, let's forget about the complexity of that problem and sneak our closet Marxism back into the game.
Astute viewers will note that the main title for this video isn't about Peterson, but about the intellectual dark web. And I want to close by explaining why their arrival on the scene is a bad sign. There are really two reasons why the arrival of these free speech warriors is a bad sign. The first is this. The kind of rigorous intellectual engagement and deep questioning that these fellows advocate for only captures the public imagination when society is already in crisis. The reason that they're here and gaining steam is because there really is a great thirst for deep engagement and a willingness to question pieties and social standards in order to create something new. But the other reason their arrival is a bad sign is because they aren't able to engage with the full history of ideas that have led to this moment. Instead, Peterson and others vilify certain players in the history, misrepresent them, and in the process pretend that certain questions have been settled when nothing could be further from the truth.
Then there's nothing to do.
As I've said to the guys, they're welcome to talk directly to each other.
Fuck
if
you.
they have
Thanks for watching this Zer0 Books video. If you enjoyed it, then you should click on that like button. And while I'm plugging things, I'll encourage you to look for our books online, at your local bookstore, or at your local library. Maybe check out The Writing on the Wall, or Kill All Normies. They're both worth reading. You might also click subscribe, because YouTube sometimes tells our subscribers when we put up a new video. Finally, if you're not a patron of our insider podcast called Inside Zer0 Books, you should be. Support us on Patreon today